The hospital room was on the 4th floor, 3rd door on the left. He'd been coming here for 6 weeks now, always at 2:30 in the afternoon. The walls were pale yellow, a color someone thought was cheerful. There was a window that looked out onto the parking lot, and beyond that a row of trees he'd never noticed before this year. His father was in the bed by the window, 78 years old, thin in a way that made the hospital gown look like it was wearing him. The cancer had started in his pancreas and spread with efficiency. The doctors had stopped using words like treatment and started using words like comfortable. He'd sit in the blue vinyl chair and they'd talk about small things, the weather, the hospital food, a nurse who looked like someone they used to know. They never talked about dying. They never talked about anything that mattered, just like they never had before. His father slept most of the time now. The morphine kept him somewhere between here and not here, but sometimes he'd wake up and his eyes would find the window and he'd watch the trees moving in the wind with an attention that seemed new, like he was seeing them for the first time, or maybe the last. One afternoon, his father said something that surprised him. Said it quietly, almost to himself. Said he wished he'd spent more time looking at trees. He didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. Just sat there in the blue chair, listening to the machines beep, watching his father watch the trees. His whole life, his father had been in motion, a corporate lawyer who worked weekends and holidays and never took real vacations. He'd provided well. Put 3 kids through college without loans, bought a house in a good neighborhood, cars that didn't break down, stability that looked like love from a distance. But he'd never been there, not really. Always somewhere else, always thinking about the next case, the next thing that needed his attention more than they did. He understood this because he'd become the same kind of man. He was 46 now, a partner at a consulting firm downtown, divorced, 2 kids he saw every other weekend, though lately the holidays had gotten complicated with scheduling. His daughter was 17, his son was 14. They were polite to him in the way you're polite to a relative you don't know very well. They'd text him sometimes, short messages that felt like obligation. His ex-wife had remarried 2 years ago, a high school teacher who coached soccer and knew his kids' friends' names. He'd met the guy once at his daughter's birthday party, seemed nice, present, the kind of man who remembered to ask follow-up questions. He'd felt something watching them together, not jealousy exactly, more like recognition. Like seeing someone standing in a spot you'd meant to stand in, but had somehow walked past without noticing. Work consumed him the way it had consumed his father, 80-hour weeks, red eyes to client sites, dinners alone in hotel rooms. His apartment was in a building with a gym he'd never used and a doorman who called him sir. It was clean and expensive and felt like a place designed for someone to pass through, not live in. He had a routine, wake at 5:30, coffee from the place on the corner where they knew his order but not his name, subway downtown, office by 7, meetings, calls, presentations, home by 9 if he was lucky, microwave something, television, sleep, repeat. On weekends, when he didn't have the kids, he'd sometimes sit in his apartment and feel the emptiness of it press against him. He'd make plans to do things, go to a museum, see a movie, call a friend, but then he'd find reasons not to. Too tired, too much work to catch up on. Maybe next weekend. Next weekend never came. He had friends, technically, people from work mostly. They'd get drinks sometimes, talk about projects and office politics. He couldn't remember the last time he'd had a conversation that required him to be vulnerable. Couldn't remember the last time anyone had asked him how he really was, and he'd told them the truth. The truth was, he didn't know how he was. He'd been moving so fast for so long that he'd stopped checking in with himself. He'd achieved what he was supposed to achieve, and somewhere along the way, he'd lost track of why. His father had a stroke on a Tuesday. Not a big one, the doctor said, but enough to change things. His right side stopped working properly. His words came out slurred and scattered. He'd tried to say something, and different words would come out, and he'd look confused and frustrated. The hospital became his new routine. Every afternoon, 2:30, the blue chair by the window. Sometimes his sister would be there, sometimes his brother, but mostly it was just him, sitting with a man he'd never really known, watching him slowly disappear. One day his father was awake and lucid, more lucid than he'd been in weeks. He looked at him with eyes that seemed clearer. He tried to say something, but the words wouldn't come. His mouth moved, but nothing happened. And then his father started crying, not loudly, just tears running down his face while he stared at the ceiling. He reached for his father's hand. It felt small and cold and unfamiliar. He couldn't remember the last time they'd touched. Maybe when he was a child, maybe never. They sat like that for a long time, hand in hand, not speaking, and he realized this was the most present he'd ever been with his father in his entire life, and it had taken dying to get here. That night, he couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about his father's tears, about what he'd been trying to say. He imagined it was something important, something that could only be said now, at the end. But maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was just, I'm scared, or I wasted it. He'd never know. He got out of bed at 3 a.m. and opened the drawer where he kept old photographs. There was a picture of his daughter when she was 5, gap-toothed and holding up a drawing she'd made of their family. Everyone in the drawing was smiling and holding hands. He tried to remember what it felt like to be the person in that drawing. Couldn't. There was a picture of his son at his first soccer game, 7 years old, too big for his uniform. He'd missed that game, had to work. His ex-wife had sent him this photo with a text that said he asked where you were. He'd texted back, sorry, big presentation, tell him I'm proud, and then he'd forgotten about it until now. He looked through the photos until the sun came up. All these moments he'd been adjacent to, but not inside of. Birthdays where he'd arrived late and left early, vacations where he'd spent half the time on his phone. His life was in these photos, but he wasn't. Not really. He was always slightly out of frame, slightly distracted, slightly somewhere else. His father died on a Sunday morning in March. He wasn't there when it happened. He'd gone home to shower and change clothes, and the nurse had called him at 6:15 to say it was over. By the time he got back to the hospital, his father's body had already been moved. The room was empty, the bed stripped, the funeral was small. His father hadn't kept in touch with many people. A life that had looked full from the inside of it, but turned out to be mostly empty when you tried to gather people to remember it. People said nice things. They talked about his work ethic, his success, his dedication. No one mentioned that he'd missed his own life while achieving all of it. That seemed like the kind of truth you weren't supposed to say at funerals. His daughter came with him. She wore a black dress he'd never seen before and sat next to him without touching him. At one point during the service, she started crying quietly. He put his arm around her and she let him, but it felt formal. When it was over, she hugged him and said she had to get back. She had homework. She was 17 years old and her grandfather had just died, and she was worried about homework. Or maybe homework was just easier than this. He watched her leave and realized she was already gone. Had been gone for years, probably. He'd been so busy working to give her a good life that he'd forgotten to be in her life. And now she was almost grown, almost out the door, and he'd missed it, all of it. That night he sat in his apartment and felt the full weight of it. Not just his father's death, but what his father's death meant. It was a preview, a glimpse of his own ending. And if he kept going the way he was going, his funeral would look the same, small, polite, full of people who knew what he did, but not who he was. He thought about the hospital room, the yellow walls, the window with the trees, his father watching them with that strange attention, like he'd finally realized what he'd been missing, and it was too late to go back and see it. He thought about all the things his father had chased, the promotions, the cases won, the money earned. And at the end, none of it had mattered. None of it had been there in that room with him. Just the trees, just the wind moving through branches. The following Monday, he went back to work. Same routine, same meetings. But something was different now. He kept noticing the gap, the space between what he was doing and what he was feeling. In meetings, he'd look around the table at the other faces, everyone performing the same dance, everyone pretending this mattered more than it did. And he'd think about the hospital room, about his father's tears, about the fact that none of these people would be at his bedside when it was his turn. His daughter texted him one night, asked if he wanted to get dinner sometime. He said yes immediately, suggested a day 2 weeks out. She wrote back, okay, with a period, not even an exclamation point, and he realized that even now, even after watching his father die, even knowing what he knew, he was still doing it, still putting it off. He called her back. She sounded surprised to hear his voice. He said, forget 2 weeks out. How about tomorrow? She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, okay, actually okay, with something in her voice that might have been hope. They met at a diner near her school. She ordered pancakes, even though it was 6 p.m. They talked awkwardly at first, but then she asked him something real, asked him if he was okay, said he'd seemed different since Grandpa died, and he didn't know how to answer that, didn't know how to explain that he wasn't okay, that he hadn't been okay for a long time, that he'd spent his whole life running from something he couldn't name, and it had cost him everything that mattered, that he was sitting across from his daughter and she felt like a stranger, and that was his fault. So he said he was fine. The same lie everyone tells, the same lie his father probably told. She nodded and looked down at her pancakes, and he could see her deciding not to push it. Learning from him, probably, learning that you don't ask the real questions, that you keep it light. He wanted to reach across the table and tell her not to be like him, not to mistake busyness for purpose, not to trade presence for achievement, not to wake up at 46 and realize she'd spent her life preparing for a moment that was never going to come. But he didn't know how to say any of that. So they finished their meal, and he paid, and they hugged in the parking lot, and she said they should do this more often. He said they should. Neither of them believed it. Driving home, he thought about the hospital room again, kept coming back to it, the yellow walls, the window, his father staring at trees like they were the most important thing in the world, because at the end they were. At the end, everything you chased falls away, and you're left with what's actually there. His father had figured it out too late, had spent 78 years building and achieving and moving, and then had 6 weeks in a hospital room to realize none of it had been the point. And here he was, 46, halfway to the same ending, still making the same choices. He kept working, kept checking his phone during dinner, kept scheduling his life like it was a problem to be optimized, because he didn't know how to stop, because stopping felt like falling, because the motion had become the meaning, and without it, he didn't know who he was. Months passed. His father's death became something that had happened rather than something that was happening. Life resumed its normal shape. The grief faded into a dull background ache. He got promoted, more responsibility, more money. His colleagues congratulated him. His mother called and said his father would have been proud. He thanked her and wondered if that was true, wondered if his father, at the end, lying in that room watching trees, would have cared at all. One afternoon, he was in his office looking at spreadsheets, and he noticed the light coming through the window. It was 4:30, almost sunset. The light was golden and soft, and it made everything look gentle. He sat there watching it change, watching the way it moved across his desk, and he realized this had been happening every day. This exact light, this exact beauty, and he'd never once stopped to see it. He thought about his father saying he wished he'd spent more time looking at trees. He thought about his daughter eating pancakes across from a father she didn't really know. He thought about the hospital room he'd end up in one day, the yellow walls, the window, the view of something he'd spent his whole life being too busy to see. Nothing changed. He didn't quit his job or do any of the dramatic things people do in stories about revelation. He just sat there in his office, watching the light fade, understanding something he didn't have the courage to act on. And he would keep missing it until there was nothing left to miss.